Welcome to Persuasion Mastery Lesson 4. I'm Don Watkins. Alright, today we're going to talk about something that I think is really fascinating, which I call fact-feeling integration. So just a quick review. We've talked about how our framework shapes how we think about issues and how communication involves properly framing issues. And so a framework is made up of our methods, how we and how our audience processes information, assumptions, how we assume the world works, like core causality about the reality and about human nature, and then goals, how are we judging good and bad. And so once you have a common framework with somebody, then what you need to do is apply that framework by looking at the facts. And so the basic idea is if we have a common goal and we have a common method and we have common assumptions, then the only question is, what are the facts? And it becomes much easier to persuade people because it's really just a question of, okay, what are the facts? And in some cases that can be very hard to get at, but it's a far less daunting problem than it is when there's a framework that is distorting how people are processing the facts. So there are some guidelines for how to introduce facts and which facts to introduce, but here's kind of 4 things that I like to keep in mind when I'm engaged in persuasion. So this is, we've established a certain framework, and then some of the best facts to use are what I call power facts. These are often surprising and incontrovertible facts that make your case. So they're very big picture and they're very powerful. So the most powerful one that I've encountered and where I really became clear on this idea was through working with Alex Epstein, the author of The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, who we've talked about in this course. And in terms of the energy and climate debate, and one of the major points that Alex makes is that if our goal is human flourishing, not to minimize our impact on the planet, then the question is not, are we impacting climate? Not is climate changing, but what is happening to climate livability? That is, our ability to cope with an inherently dangerous climate. And there's one crucial fact that Alex points out that is really can transform how people think about this issue, just this single fact. And it's the statistic of climate-related deaths. So, we're basically taught that climate is becoming more dangerous, but the reality is that climate-related deaths have decreased by 98% over the last century. And that should raise a massive question about, well, how if climate is getting worse, is our ability to cope with it getting better? And that opens people's eyes to the fact, and you can explain this then, that, well, actually the major thing that determines how safe or dangerous climate is not what is happening to the physical climate, it is our ability to use technology and energy to adapt to an inherently dangerous climate, and not even just to adapt to it, but to master it. So you want to be on the lookout in any issue that you're concerned with. What are some big, incontrovertible facts? So this leads to the second point. So the statistic about climate-related deaths comes from a nonpartisan organization. I'm going blank on the name right now, but it's a nonpartisan, very well-respected database called MDAT. And in general, you really want to be careful about what sources you're citing, where you're getting facts, and the most compelling facts come from either nonpartisan sources. These are often government statistics. So like in the US, you might look at the Bureau of Labor Management, but the World Bank. I mean, there's a lot of these different organizations, and so you want to, what you don't want to be doing is citing like, oh, here's what the Heritage Foundation said. Now, there's some cases where partisan think tanks or partisan intellectuals are the only source for a certain kind of fact, but to the extent you can avoid it, you want to avoid that. The one exception is you can often benefit by using your opponent's own data, right? So if you take an issue that's traditionally puts you in opposition to what do you want to call it, the left or Democrats, and Brookings Institute or one of these left-wing think tanks or a Vox poll or something finds something that makes your case, then that can be a legitimate thing to use, but there you want to be more careful, because sometimes you can be too clever for your own good. You actually want to think, do I really believe this is a fact? Do I have reason to think that in this case that they were scrupulous? Next point is, be skeptical of studies. And it often happens that we try to persuade not by sharing with people the facts and ideas that actually persuaded us, but we start with the assumption of my conclusion is true, and now I'm just going to grab on anything that seems to support it. And so, somebody will be convinced that the minimum wage is wrong because of basic economic reasoning that, once you make it illegal to work for less than a certain wage, you will increase unemployment. So they'll be convinced by that basic reasoning, or the basic morality of people should be able to determine mutually agreeable terms on which to work. That shouldn't be dictated by the government. But then they'll, write something on the minimum wage, and they'll just start citing, this study that found a 2.5 increase in unemployment after this state raised its minimum wage. It's not always illegitimate to use these kinds of studies, but you'd have to ask, is this really why I believe what I believe? Am I introducing these studies after, giving the core logic for it? Because that is, a live part of the debate, is what do we make of these different studies? You need to have a clear reason, because the fact is, I have found almost zero cases where people have been persuaded by a study or a series of these kinds of studies. And it's because in most cases, they are open to interpretation, to objections. Every one of these studies can be picked apart and pulled apart. And so just kind of throwing something out there because it seems to support your conclusion, you're not going to convince anybody, and it's in the end dishonest, because it's not really why you believe what you believe. And then the question would be, okay, well, have you looked and seen, are there conflicting studies, and why don't you agree with those? And if you can pick those apart, did you apply that same kind of scrupulous picking apart to the studies you're citing? So in general, I avoid them unless there's a really clear cut, unless I think there's a really compelling reason to include it, and I have a strong reason to think that this study or this collection of studies actually is getting at something in reality that there's no other way to get at. Finally, a point about facts is that facts need context. You'll often see just kind of facts thrown out there as if they're supposed to be powerful on their own. So, for example, we'll often get political debates about different policies where the liberty movement will say, oh, this is going to cost X billion or X trillion dollars. And that is, in the end, meaningless, because people need to relate those numbers to something. And one of the things that's happened as government spending has increased is now numbers that used to sound really large don't sound that large. Like, before 2008, 2009 crisis, $1 trillion was this unimaginable number. And if you said, oh, this policy is going to cost $100 billion, that seemed expensive. And after 2008, 2009, I found, unless you were talking trillions, it didn't seem that expensive. And then during the COVID pandemic, the government passed how expensive, well over $1 trillion. It might have been several trillions, but nobody blinked an eye. These numbers are not meaningful by themselves. And so kind of three ways of adding context to facts are, one is personalization, right? So instead of talking about how, this policy will increase energy costs by $100 billion. Well, that is a collective statistic that nobody can relate to. But if you can personalize it and say, this will raise your energy bill by 10%, that then becomes a meaningful, relatable number to people. Normalization. So often the negatives of the views that we support are treated as these like alien risks that we're just imposing on people. So to go back to the energy debate, uh, people will talk about the risks of fracking to creating earthquakes or to in getting into the water system. And first of all, you have to actually get some clarity on how great are those risks, because those are often exaggerated, but then they need to be compared to other risks. They need to be normalized, which is, for example, the earthquake point can be true, but in general, we're talking about very minor earth movements that are comparable to what truckers or construction sites create whenever they do their work. Or if we're talking about the water, we can talk about how, there's a minor threat to water, but it's far less than many other types of drilling that take place, because fracking occurs, basically a mile underground, separated by by a lot of rock. So it's very unlikely to pollute groundwater in the way that many other drilling operations are. And then finally, there's superiorization. So one of the things that you would see is, it used to be when Alex started in energy, he would point out that none of the big oil companies had like any pictures of oil on their web pages. It was all like solar and wind, which was, a tiny sliver of a fraction of what they were doing. And I think in part because he was pointing this out, there's been a shift, and you've seen and heard the industry make more and more positive comments about itself. But it's always, it's never a comparison to its competitors. It's never, hey, we're superior to solar and wind. It's just, hey, we keep the lights on. But if the whole issue is, yeah, but we think you can be replaced with something else and something better that keep the lights on, then you don't actually get any power from that. That facts need, for your positive option, it needs to be superiorized, as Alex calls it. It needs to be set in comparison to the alternative. Because, think about Steve Jobs selling the iPhone. He wouldn't just get out and say, like, look at these amazing features. It's look at how these features compare to the competitors. Look how these features compare to previous iPhones. That's going to be just a really powerful point in terms of how to use facts. One of the most common things that I've heard over the years I've been involved with the Liberty Movement is this kind of frustration or way of explaining why our ideas are not more successful. And that's, well, look, we care about facts, the other side cares about emotion. We're good at giving factual, logical arguments, and they're good at manipulating people's feelings. And I call this the big lie. And in part, I think it's we're not actually very good on getting the facts, but I want to set that aside. And the best way I have to explain it is, years ago, I participated in a contest where we were supposed to make a moral case for freedom. And when I went into this contest, I sat down and listened to the other, people involved make their cases. And then we went and had a big, lunch ceremony where the organizer came out and explained sort of why this contest was important, what it was all about. And what he said was fascinating, because it was, look, this is not, political debates are not about logic. They're not about facts. They're about feelings. And so we need to tap into feelings. And how do you tap into feelings? Well, you tell stories. And so suddenly everything I witnessed, including the fact that I lost this contest, made sense to me, which is that what the other people were doing is they would come out and say something like this. All right, the subject is Medicaid. Here's a sob story about somebody who, was on Medicaid and couldn't find a doctor and got sick and died. And then the idea is, all right, now you're making a moral case for freedom, and you're addressing emotions, and therefore you're going to win. And I think this is completely wrong. It's a fundamentally wrong way to think, and the fundamental reason that it's wrong is that it misunderstands the relationship between facts and emotions. There's something right about the way that they're thinking about it, but there's a fundamental flaw. And so, where do emotions come from? And we can ask, just take two statements that are virtually identical. And I'm assuming you're somebody who values liberty and values joy and humor, let's say. So Tom Hanks was hit by a bus. Elizabeth Warren was hit by a bus. Virtually the same fact, but you very likely had two different emotional reactions, or you would if you thought that it actually happened. And that's because there's a link between facts and emotions. I just named two facts, and yet your emotions were different, and the link is your values. If you were somebody who was a fervent progressive, and maybe, thought that, like, Tom Hanks was annoying, which I can't relate to you on either of those two, then you might have thought, oh my gosh, Elizabeth Warren was hit by a car or hit by a bus, that's awful, and Tom Hanks, big deal. You could have completely different reactions because your values are different. And so that's what we need to understand. In order to make a factual / logical and emotional argument, we need to be focused on the issue of values. And notice that framing has set us up for this. When we're framing an issue, we're tying it to a goal. We're establishing what value we're after. And so we're naturally in a position to connect facts and emotions. An example to go back to Alex's work again is he doesn't just start talking about the benefits of energy, but we have a goal of human flourishing. And now we're going to talk about the facts of what actually promotes human flourishing and energy and what harms human beings. And so we're tied to a value that's going to then evoke emotions. When we learn how bad solar or wind are, and then we hear that there's plans to basically eradicate fossil fuels and force us to rely on solar and wind, you can see like that will be catastrophic for human beings, and you're naturally set up to feel an emotion. So when I was talking about the moral case for freedom contest, I made the point that there was something right about what they were saying. And what was right was that we do need to impact people's emotions, and we do need to use stories in order to do it. What was wrong was that that's the only thing you have to do. But how do we actually use stories to do this? Well, first of all, let's step back and why are stories so impactful? And there's actually two related reasons. But I want to focus on the emotional side first. Stories access emotions by making abstractions concrete. And that's what we react emotionally to, is primarily concrete. And this is tied to the other use of stories, which is that the reasons stories are impactful and the reasons that they elicit emotions are because abstractions don't exist, right? They stand for, or their meaning is the specific things in reality they refer to. So take an abstraction. Minimum wage causes unemployment. The meaning of that is the actual people who lose their jobs, who have lost their jobs, will lose their jobs whenever the government increases the minimum wage. That's what it means. And it's those stories of those specific people that will elicit the emotions that will help people get, wow, this is not just a fact that the minimum wage causes unemployment, but this is a travesty. This is an unjust fact. This is something I'm angered by and outraged by and want to change. So what is a story? It's not just something that happens. It's not just like bad thing happens to person, good thing happens to a person. A story broadly is a person with a goal faces a problem and tries to solve it in the face of obstacles. That is, they're aiming at something and trying to overcome the obstacles in order to achieve their goal. And in terms of using stories to promote freedom, there's 4 main stories that I find are incredibly useful. So there's humanizing stories, challenge triumph stories, justice narratives, and contrast stories. So humanizing stories are aimed at building empathy. And the best example of this is Atlas Shrugged. So if you think about why people oppose liberty, one element of it is that the people who are being sacrificed are unrelatable, right? The titans of industry, millionaires and billionaires, the 1%, right? They are, they're unrelatable. And so it's very easy, like there's a caricature in people's minds of like this uncaring, person who doesn't do anything useful, kicks their legs up and smokes cigars, and somehow like has all this money they can buy yachts with. And in Atlas Shrugged, what we do is we see up close these characters, what really motivates them, what their achievements really involve, the kind of struggles and maltreatment they endure. And so one impact of this is that they're humanized, they're relatable. And so now when a person is considering real life in the world and they hear, we're just going to, seize all the wealth from the 1%, now in their mind is not a caricature, but an actual, they see Hank Rearden or Dagny Taggart and think, yeah, well, that's not fair. That's not right. Or at least they're open to seeing that now because they're thinking about real people, that business type has a relatable meaning to them. One of the, and Atlas Shrugged is actually going to come up throughout this because it doesn't just humanize, or part of the way it humanizes through challenge triumph storytelling. That's what creates inspiration. When somebody's overcoming obstacles to achieve a goal, then that's what's creating an admiration for them. So it's not just that we can relate to Hank Rearden or Dagny Taggart, these two business leaders in Atlas Shrugged. It's that we admire them because we've actually seen the kind of challenges they've had to overcome. We don't just see Hank Rearden on a yacht. What we see is a guy who has spent 10 years trying to create an innovative new metal and who has finally succeeded through countless obstacles. And then what we're going to see, and this is related to justice narratives that I'll come to in a second, is that even once he's created it, that like his problems have only just begun because this is a new innovation and it's going to be attacked and potentially barred. No customers are going to want to buy it. And so he has to overcome all of this in order to actually succeed on the market. And so you've built in inspiration and admiration whenever you show people facing obstacles and having to overcome it. So imagine, for example, if you're writing about look, Facebook created it. Mark Zuckerberg created Facebook and its platform, and he has the right to decide what kind of speech takes place on it. And it's not censorship for him to make those decisions. It is censorship for the government to. A core thing that you want to be able to do is convey the story of the kind of difficulties and challenges he had to overcome in creating that platform. That is, we need to see that it was an achievement. And so that's going to make it far more emotionally meaningful how unjust it would be for the government to come along and control it in the name of like promoting conservative voices or something like that. So then justice narrative. And what justice narratives evoke is anger and indignation. That is, a justice narrative, we're going to see that the good has been penalized and or the evil has been rewarded. And notice how humanizing and challenge triumph storytelling set the groundwork for a justice narrative. That is, to say that the good is penalized, we have to see the good as the good. And so, to appreciate the injustice of telling Mark Zuckerberg what he has to do with the platform he has created, it's important that he be a relatable person who triumphed over challenges in order for people to really have that resonate emotionally. Whereas if he's just this kind of vague, villainous figure in their minds, then they might, at an abstract level, have the view of, well, I guess everybody has a right to control, their property. But it's not even 1% as powerful as if you get the full picture of a human being challenging or triumphing over challenges and then being penalized after that fact. Same thing on the other side with the evil being rewarded. You don't need to dehumanize. Rather, to convey the evil of something, you want to humanize their victims, and uh, and 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 illustrate the victims' triumph over challenges. Finally, there's contrast stories, and basically, what here you're getting usually are the stakes, but these can be used in a lot of different ways. And basically, all I mean by contrast story is that you're taking the same phenomenon and you're in effect doing an A/B test. Let me give you an example that isn't policy related, but is one of the best things I ever wrote, which was I wrote a piece on the issue of greed, and I contrasted the stories of Steve Jobs and of Bernie Madoff. And particularly, I was focused on their motives. What were they trying to do in their careers? What got them out of bed in the morning? And then their methods. How did they go about pursuing their goal? And what I was arguing was that we put both of these people under the same category of greed. But if we actually look at them, and they're really symbols for criminals in general and productive achievement in general, what we find is that they have fundamentally different motives and fundamentally different methods, and you can't group them under the same concept and say, oh, well, they're both greedy. And in particular, if you're thinking about greed as like unlimited desire for more, that applies to a Steve Jobs, right? He wants more and more achievement all the way throughout his life. And in that sense, it's never enough achievement, never enough success. But that is not the right way to think about Madoff. The problem was not that he wanted too much of other people's money. It's that he wanted other people's money. It's not like he would have been noble if he had been a pickpocket. It's not like, if he had been satisfied with $5 of other people's money, well, then we wouldn't have a problem. The problem is not greed. It's not wanting too much. What his problem is that he was a predator and regarded other people's lives and property as his to be a parasite on. In policy kinds of cases, contrast stories will often be like, here's a before and after picture, or here, so before this policy, America, in my book on Social Security, it was America before the welfare state was a place where people prospered, where they were self-reliant, where they were able to cope with challenges, including the challenges of old age. And then after the creation of the welfare state and Social Security, things actually got worse in important ways. So you're contrasting the before and after. You can also contrast like two different locations, right? So you could have, here's two very similar places, and I'm going to tell stories that compare, the one where a minimum wage was dramatically increased and one where the minimum wage stayed the same, and see like what happened to the businesses in those areas and so on. But it's helping get at the truth about an issue by telling kind of contrasting cases in specific terms. I want to talk about one other kind of story. I'm going to talk about it very briefly. So this is a one that I learned from Alex Epstein. And if you go to my YouTube page, which you're probably on right now, but Don Watkins Live, then you can find in my playlists, I have videos of other people who have a lot to say about persuasion and communication, and you'll find several videos where Alex is talking about opinion stories. But basically what this is that rather than giving people your opinion and it just leading to them saying, no, that's wrong, and being defensive and the conversation going nowhere, what you do is you share the story of how you came to your opinion. So the story Alex usually uses to illustrate this, I think, is really good, which is, he's written a book called The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. And so if people ask him what he does, he could say, oh, I prove that we should use more fossil fuels, not solar or wind. And of course, this would, in effect, almost certainly create a defensive reaction in people and lead to arguments or, to insults, Lord knows. But what he does instead is say, well, it's interesting. I got really interested in energy when I realized that it was the industry that powers every other industry. And so if we make good decisions, like everything will get better. And if we make bad decisions about energy, everything will get worse. And I was really surprised that when I looked carefully at both the positives and the negatives of our different energy alternatives, that actually we should be using way more fossil fuels. So notice he reached a really controversial conclusion, but he's not telling the other person that it's true or that they should believe it. He's just explaining why he believes it. And when you use an opinion story, you're respecting the other person's independence. You're recognizing that they haven't gone through that process, and so you shouldn't expect that they would be in agreement with it. And it leads to usually curiosity and intrigue rather than defensiveness and frustrating fights. A few things that make for an opinion story is you're showing that you struggled with a difficult issue. Like, you're recognizing that the truth here is not obvious and you had to go through a process. Well, what kind of process did you go through? A thoughtful framework. So notice that in Alex's story, he talks about he looked carefully at the positives and the negatives of all the energy alternatives. He's showing that, like, look, if you want to think through this issue, you can't just in a biased way look at the positives of solar and wind and the negatives of fossil fuels. So he's indicating that he went through a thoughtful framework, and the person is thinking that, oh, maybe I could go through that process too. And then he drew a rational conclusion. That, as you could see, if the benefits of fossil fuels outweighed solar and wind, it makes sense why he would support them. Contrast that to something that when we work with people in the fossil fuel industry, often we'll ask them, like, why do you think fossil fuels are good? And their story will be, often they'll start out by telling a story like, well, I grew up in an oil town, and like it's just been part of my life from the beginning. And so, I think oil is good. And that's not a rational conclusion. That's not a reason to think that oil is good. It might explain biographically where you started out is, it never occurred to me that it was anything but good. But your opinion story has to bring out the actual rational process of thinking through the issue and drawing a logical conclusion. And then finally, it's about you, not them. So a very wrong way to tell an opinion story is, I used to be like you and think that fossil fuels were really bad, but then now I am much superior because I recognize. No, like, you're never mentioning the other person. You're not relating them yourself to the other person. You're not saying I used to be in your shoes. You're just talking about you, where you started and how you ended up where you were. One thing that I think can kind of be confusing to some people, because it was to me for a long time, was, well, what about if you're not Alex Epstein, who like basically discovered the moral case for fossil fuels from scratch, or virtually from scratch? What if it's something that you learned from somebody else? Well, that's an opinion story if you tell it the right way. It's, I wasn't sure what to think about minimum wage, and I read these really interesting arguments by economists and intellectuals like Thomas Sowell and Henry Hazlitt, and recognized that that the minimum wage doesn't just make sure that some people get paid more. It means that some people can't work at all because their work isn't valued at, say, $15 an hour. And I thought that was really unfair and really tragic. I think that I ended up agreeing with them that everybody should have the right to work and take that first step in the ladder of success. So you can talk about the story of how you learned something from somebody, but you want to not just say, well, I read Thomas Sowell and he proves that the minimum wage should be abolished, but you're in effect going through the thought process that you went through as you encountered their arguments. All right, so finally, last topic for this lesson, heaven and hell narratives. And this is what I call the ultimate persuasion structure. So what a heaven and hell narrative is really an arc story, or it's a larger story in which you can tell many kind of sub-stories and deal with many sub-issues. So here's something I wrote on the COVID-19 pandemic. This was relatively early on when almost nobody publicly was pushing back against lockdowns. There was just a handful of people, And I was so frustrated by what I was hearing that I kind of dashed this off. And it ended up being probably one of the most widely read things I've ever written. And I just put it up on my Facebook page and then later a Medium page. But I'm going to read it, and it's relatively short, but I want to read it because there's really important thing going on in the structure that I think made this so impactful, aside from just the fact that it came out when it did. Here's the harsh truth. Regardless of what we do, many, if not most Americans will get COVID-19. The lockdowns, whatever one thinks of them, were never sold to us as a way to eradicate the disease. They were sold as a way to flatten the curve so that the medical system didn't become overwhelmed, leading to unnecessary deaths. Eradicating the disease without a vaccine is a fantasy. All of the evidence I've seen indicates that for most, if not all of the country, we are at low risk for overwhelming the healthcare system. That's particularly true if we continue to take intelligent voluntary measures like washing our hands, social distancing, wearing masks, and avoiding mass gatherings. And if we continue to scale medical capacity for places hardest hit. All right, so that's just set up. But there's a lot to analyze there, but I'm just going to focus on the structure of it right now. So now we have the setup. So what are the lockdowns achieving? Be very careful about answering that question based on your own experience. Do you still have a job? Can you work remotely? Do you have savings? Do you live in a nice house with heating, AC, internet, family members to keep you company? Do you have a husband or a wife who can help homeschool the kids while you work? I hope so. I hope that your life isn't being destroyed by our response of indefinite lockdowns. But for tens of millions of Americans, the story is different. It is for me. I've seen people trivializing their situation as if they have no right to earn money and enjoy their lives because they aren't healthcare workers. Worse, I've seen people say that anyone who desires to return to work is essentially a killer who is callously indifferent to the people they may infect if they get sick. That is a moral outrage. If you have ever had the flu, you have probably been indirectly responsible for someone's death. The fact is, that is a fact about human beings. We transmit diseases that have the potential to harm others. No, I'm not equating COVID-19 and the flu. Clearly, COVID-19 is more dangerous. The issue here is moral responsibility. But here's the thing. All of you who do have jobs and savings and all the rest, we will reach a point if we don't start to liberate the economy when all of that will go away. The U.S. literally cannot survive many more months of an economic freeze. Do you remember how quickly the dominoes fell in 2008? So far, our financial system has been able to absorb the punches as business collapses. Do you think it can do that forever? Do you think that the energy industry will be able to survive without credit? Do you think our food supply chain can survive without credit? How many people will die then? We must reopen the economy as fast as we can, and we must do so while managing the disease as best as we can. That includes selective isolation for the most vulnerable. I have family members in this category, and if it matters, they support reopening the economy. They recognize that it would be immoral to demand that we sacrifice the whole country to reduce their odds of getting the disease. Reopen as fast as possible, as smart as possible. That's the only moral, compassionate course of action. The alternative is unthinkable. So, looking back, there's things I would change. Particularly, I say open as fast as possible, but that's very ambiguous. What I really meant to say was open today, period. And there's some other points, but what I want to highlight here is that what I'm painting is I'm painting a picture of two different paths. One is the path that we're on, and this is the path to hell. It is a path that is destroying lives and is going to destroy more lives, and it's not actually going to stop people from getting the disease. All it was supposed to do was prevent all it can do is slow down the spread, and we've already slowed it down, far enough that free people can adapt to it. So there's no positives on this road. It's all negative, and it's massive negative. It is the collapse of the economy and people dying. And then it's heaven. Now it's not literal heaven because we're dealing with a inherently negative context. But the point is that opening gives us all of the benefits. It gives us the ability to pursue our health in intelligent ways, and it gives us the ability to save the economy. Another thing that I would change that I didn't have here, and in part was this was early on, I just didn't know as much about it, is in owning the health issue. One of the points is that the lockdowns don't clearly have any health benefits and might actually have health costs, in that you're locking together people in unventilated areas often, and so if one person's ill, you're giving massive doses of the disease to other people. And there's more complexity. We don't have to go into a whole COVID thing, but what I'm trying to highlight is that you're showing two paths, and they're not just like, well, one's 2% better than the other, but you're showing how one path is fundamentally bad and the other path is fundamentally good. And one is heaven, one is hell, and that is the most persuasive structure that you can have. Now, I want to go through and explain some important points about heaven and hell narratives. I should first of all say, like, it's not just Don Watkins who uses this. I think the most persuasive things you see are heaven and hell narratives. I think Atlas Shrugged is, and in fact, you see this sort of emphasized in, if you're familiar with the novel Galt's Speech, where he talks about the morality of life, that is his morality, and the morality of death, that is the ruler's morality, and how the world needs to choose. One road leads to heaven on earth. I mean, it has every human value that one could aspire to, and the other is hell. There's nothing good about it, nothing appealing. And so you have this clear-cut choice. And if people believe that that is really the choice, then yeah, they're going to go with you on the road to heaven almost always. So first of all, this is not always the right structure. Like, if you're talking about plastic bag bans, it's not going to be, well, I mean, one is this nightmare scenario where we're all keeling over because we don't have plastic bags, and the other is, we just like dress in plastic bags and, swim in plastic bags. Like, we'll just like, it'll be plastic bag utopia. No. For an op-ed or something, often it's not the right format. Usually what you have, though, is you have core content, and I'll talk about this more in a later lesson, like a book or a course, where you're making your whole case, your full case, and your full case should almost always be a heaven and hell narrative if you're talking about liberty-related issues. But there will be a lot of sub-issues or a lot of smaller pieces where what you're doing is you're giving a concrete or addressing an objection that's relevant to establishing your heaven and hell narratives. The second is that to create a heaven and hell narrative almost always means you have to reframe the alternatives. So, in the COVID-19 one, our alternative was presented to the world as health or the economy. If you care about health, if you care about life or death, clearly you're on the side of lockdowns. And then if you're opposed to lockdowns, yeah, you just want people to be able to get their hair cut and earn a few more bucks. And so what I reframed it as was, no, we can have health, prosperity, everything is on the side of ending the lockdowns versus crushing health, crushing prosperity for everybody, which is continuing the lockdown. So you have to reframe the decision that people are making in order to get a clear shot that this is heaven and hell. So the way that issues are going to be defined and the alternatives that are going to be defined publicly are almost never going to be in favor of liberty, right? Or liberty would already be successful in that realm. So you really have to be able to redefine the paths, and then the next key is what your argument is doing is justifying that, yeah, this path is heaven. Like unlocking the economy, ending the lockdowns, that gives us prosperity. That gives us health. A lot of the argument is explaining why those things fall under the category of ending lockdowns and why they don't fall under the category of continuing lockdowns. Then you want to make heaven and hell intellectually and emotionally real. So, notice that even in my short little piece, I tried to make real what it would mean for the lockdowns to cripple the economy. So I reminded people of the closest thing they could relate to, which was 2008, and how fast things happened, it's not like we knew it was coming and had time to avoid it. And for many of these people, it was probably a scary time. And then I tried to make it even more vivid by, okay, well, what does it mean that, credit collapses or something like that? Well, it means no energy. It means no food. And so it's trying to really get the reality of the situation across. And then, as I've indicated, you want to own all the value issues. If you ever find that you're in a debate, whether it's about fracking or climate change or social security or healthcare, or what our regulations should be on Wall Street or occupational licensing, you need to own all of the value issues. If you basically put all right, well, on the one side is like the economy, and on the other side is something like health or whatever the other value at stake is, you're going to lose that debate. You have to own all the legitimate value issues, and if you find that you don't own it, it means that you haven't framed the issue properly, and that illegitimate anti-freedom values are going uncontested in the debate. So that's it for this lesson, and tune in next time when we're going to dive into one of the most interesting topics, motivation. Talk to you then.